She had 11 seconds to decide, and every one of them tasted like blood. The warning tone sliced through the cockpit, sharp and unforgiving. The helicopter shuddered, not violently, just enough to whisper the truth. Something was wrong. Behind her, someone screamed. Not panic, pain. The kind that claws its way out of a chest when the body knows it's running out of time. She tightened her grip on the controls. Land now, the checklist voice inside her said. Follow procedure, save yourself. Or keep flying. Take a damaged aircraft through unstable wind toward a rooftop she'd never practiced, toward a hospital that was still just a promise on the horizon, toward a man bleeding out behind her who didn't yet know she was the reason he was still alive. She didn't answer the checklist. She flew. The city below had been waking slowly that morning, unaware it was about to be interrupted by a reckoning. Spanish moss hung heavy from old trees. The river moved like it always did, patient, indifferent. No one on the ground knew that a woman most of them had never noticed was fighting gravity, protocol, and memory all at once. She wasn't supposed to be in that seat. Officially, she was a rookie flight nurse. Quiet, competent, forgettable. The kind of person people trust with needles and IV lines, not with machines that fall out of the sky if you make one wrong decision. What they didn't know, what she'd worked very hard to keep buried, was that her hands remembered this. The way the controls resisted just slightly when the wind shifted. The way the engine's pitch told you more than any gauge ever could. The way fear had to be acknowledged and then set aside, like a tool you didn't need right now. She learned all of that a lifetime ago, in places where the sky was hostile and the ground was worse. But that life had ended, grounded by paperwork, by a medical ruling that reduced her to a risk factor instead of a person, by years of silence she wore like armor. Until this moment. Until there was no one else. The man in the back was a Navy SEAL, 22 years of service, a body that had endured more than most people could imagine, and now it was failing him, fast and without ceremony. Blood loss doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care who you are or what you've survived. He groaned again. Someone shouted her name. She didn't turn around. She couldn't afford to. The wind hit them sideways, hard enough to shove the helicopter off its line. She corrected without thinking, muscle memory waking up like an old scar aching before rain. She felt strangely calm, not fearless, just focused. This was the calm she'd missed, the kind that only shows up when everything matters. As they pushed forward, something else stirred beneath the urgency, a memory she'd tried not to touch, a sound, a voice, a song she used to hum when the world narrowed to a single task. It slipped out of her without permission, low and steady, threading itself between radio calls and engine noise. She didn't know the man behind her could hear it. She didn't know he'd heard it once before, a decade earlier, bleeding in the dark while a helicopter that shouldn't have been flying carried him out of hell. She didn't know yet that the past was catching up to both of them. All she knew was this: people had underestimated her for a long time. She'd let them. It was easier than fighting. But now there was no hiding. Now there was only the sky, the failing machine, and the quiet certainty that if she let go, even for a second, someone would die. So she didn't let go. Sometimes the moment that defines you doesn't announce itself. It just arrives and demands everything you have. And whether anyone believes in you or not stops mattering the instant you realize you believe in yourself again. The helicopter surged forward, wounded but obedient. And the woman everyone thought was just a nurse carried them all towards something that felt a lot like redemption. But why had she learned to disappear so well? Long before anyone was screaming in the back of her aircraft, before alarms and wind and blood forced her hand, she had already been practicing invisibility. It started the day she was told she could no longer fly. The room had been quiet, too quiet, white walls, neutral voices, A decision delivered gently, the way institutions soften the blow of taking something from you forever. A medical board, a diagnosis, a signature at the bottom of a page that said her body no longer met the standard. She remembered nodding, thanking them, walking out without breaking. That's what she was proud of later, how composed she'd been, how professional, how she hadn't begged. What she didn't admit was that something in her shut down that day, not loudly, just enough to survive. So she reinvented herself, stripped away the parts of her past that asked too many questions, took a job where no one would expect her to lead, to command, to decide, a place where skill could hide behind service. She became useful instead of visible. At first it worked. She told herself it was enough. Helping people mattered, saving lives mattered. The sky was just a place, not a purpose. But every time a helicopter lifted off without her, something inside her went quiet in a way that felt like mourning. She learned the new aircraft the way you learn someone else's language, carefully, politely, asking questions she already knew the answers to, letting people assume she was inexperienced instead of dangerous. Dangerous was what she used to be, dangerous to the enemy, dangerous to herself. So she smiled when they underestimated her, let them talk over her in briefings, let them think she was anxious when she was actually calculating. And when the insurance audits began, when suits with cold eyes started measuring lives in dollars per mile, she stayed quiet then too. She watched flights get delayed, watched decisions get questioned midair, watched time, the one thing trauma never gives back, get wasted. It made her angry, not explosive anger, the kind that burns clean and slow. She documented everything. Still, she said nothing, because silence had kept her safe before. Until the day it didn't. The call came in the middle of an ordinary shift. Mass casualties, training exercise gone wrong, multiple wounded, limited air assets. She heard it over the hospital speakers and felt the old world snap into focus. This was the kind of chaos she understood. She waited for someone else to solve the problem, for a pilot to appear, for protocol to catch up. No one did. That was when she spoke. "I can fly it." The words felt unreal in her mouth, too honest, too exposed. Faces turned, confusion, disbelief. She didn't argue, didn't justify, she moved. Because there are moments when explaining costs too much time. Running across the tarmac, she felt fear for the first time in years. Not of flying, of being seen, of what would happen if she succeeded or if she failed. She pulled on gloves that weren't hers, leather worn smooth by hands that used to trust her, a reminder of loss, of survival, of unfinished business. When the engine came alive, something else did too. Not pride, not relief. Recognition. This was who she had always been. And whatever came after, punishment, consequences, judgment, could wait. Someone was dying. That was reason enough. But what happens when the past answers back? She felt it before she heard it, the shift behind her, the subtle change in the rhythm of the cabin. The medic's voice sharpened, numbers dropped, blood pressure falling fast. She adjusted course and altitude without thinking, her mind splitting cleanly into parallel tracks. Fly, listen, anticipate, adapt. This was the space she used to live in. And then the voice came. Not loud, not clear, just a word scraped raw by effort. Nightingale. Her hands tightened. For half a second, just half, the world tilted. No one had called her that in years, not since the night everything broke, not since she learned how much a name could weigh. She didn't turn around, she didn't answer. She couldn't afford to. But the sound followed her, not in the air but in memory. Another aircraft, another war, another man bleeding while she kept her voice calm and her hands steady and sang because silence would have killed them faster. She forced herself back into the present. The rooftop was in sight now. wind gusting harder near the river, hydraulic pressure holding barely. She flew the approach like she'd been taught when mistakes weren't allowed. Firm, committed, no hesitation. When the skids touched down, perfectly aligned, she exhaled for the first time in minutes. The rotors slowed. Hands pulled open doors. Bodies moved fast. The man was gone from the cabin before she could look at him. She stayed seated, staring forward, waiting for the shaking to start. It didn't. Instead, there was silence. Later, she would learn what people saw from the ground. How the woman they dismissed stepped out of the cockpit like she belonged there. How faces changed. How assumptions cracked. Later, consequences would arrive. Investigations, meetings, questions no one wanted answers to until now. But not yet. First came the hospital room, the recognition in a stranger's eyes, the confirmation that some things you do echo longer than you expect. "I've been looking for you," he told her, voice thick. 10 years. She didn't know what to say. She had never done it for recognition, never for gratitude. She had done it because someone needed her. That had always been enough. As word spread, as uniforms filled hallways and salutes were rendered she didn't feel worthy of, something inside her finally loosened. Not the pain, the shame. She realized she hadn't been hiding because she was broken. She had been hiding because she was afraid of wanting the sky again. Why does dignity always arrive quietly? There was no parade, no headlines, just meetings behind closed doors and decisions that suddenly went her way instead of over her head. Programs were reviewed, policies reversed. People who had treated lives like numbers found themselves facing questions they couldn't spreadsheet away. She was offered things she'd once dreamed about. She turned some of them down. Not because she couldn't fly anymore, but because she could choose how. She stayed, taught, built something better out of what had almost been taken, trained others to be steady when the math turned brutal, to act without ego, to lead without needing permission when lives were on the line. On quiet mornings she flew again, openly now, no hiding, no shrinking. She still hummed when things got hard. It reminded her who she was, and who she had always been. Sometimes the world tells you you're finished, that your best work is behind you, that a single decision defines the rest of your life. But dignity doesn't argue. It simply acts. And sometimes, when the moment comes, the person everyone overlooked is the only one who knows how to bring everyone home. Why did her hands feel steadier now than they ever had when she was officially allowed to fly? The question surfaced as the helicopter's rotors slowed to a whisper and the rooftop dissolved into motion around her. Boots hit metal. Orders overlapped. The wounded were gone before the engines finished spooling down, and still she sat there, helmet on, fingers resting lightly on the controls like they might vanish if she let go. For a moment, she wondered if anyone would tell her to get out of the seat. No one did. People rushed past her without looking twice, focused on blood loss and time and doors that needed to open right now. She watched them move with the calm distance of someone who had once been part of that chaos and then exiled from it. This was familiar, too familiar, and yet, for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a visitor. She finally unstrapped and climbed out. The air on the rooftop smelled like fuel and antiseptic. Below, the city kept breathing, unaware that a line had just been crossed. She handed the aircraft over without ceremony, gave a brief report and stepped back. That was when she felt it. Eyes. Not the quick glances of curiosity or the distracted looks of people doing their jobs. These were different, measured, recalculating. The kind of looks that arrive when a story people thought they understood suddenly changes shape. She ignored them and walked toward the stairwell, adrenaline already bleeding into something heavier. Her legs felt oddly hollow, as if the strength she'd borrowed to get through the flight was being reclaimed. Inside the hospital, the noise wrapped around her again. Monitors, voices, shoes squeaking on polished floors. She blended in easily now, just another pair of scrubs moving with purpose. That had always been her talent, knowing how to disappear in plain sight. Except this time, the disappearance didn't work. "Hey!" She turned. The paramedic from the flight stood a few steps behind her, eyes searching her face like he was trying to match it to something he'd half remembered. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded automatically. "Yeah." He hesitated. "You flew like you've been doing that your whole life." The old instinct rose immediately. Deflect, minimize, move on. "I've had some training," she said. He didn't smile, didn't push, just nodded slowly like a man filing away a detail he'd come back to later. "Right," he said, "some." They parted ways, but the feeling stayed with her. The sense that the careful boundaries she'd built were thinning, that today had cracked something open she might not be able to close again. She spent the rest of the shift moving on autopilot, cleaning instruments, updating charts, responding when spoken to. The body remembered how to work even when the mind lagged behind. But every so often her thoughts jumped back to the cockpit, to the warning light, to the voice behind her. Nightingale. She hadn't imagined it. She knew that now. The way the word had landed inside her was too precise, too heavy with history. Someone out there knew. The realization should have scared her more than it did. Instead, it made her tired. Late that night, when the hospital finally exhaled, she found herself sitting alone in the locker room, staring at her hands. They were steady again, empty. The borrowed gloves were gone, returned to her bag like a secret she hadn't decided what to do with. She touched the faint scar along her jaw without thinking. 6 years ago, she'd woken up in a hospital bed with no memory of how she'd gotten there. Just pain, confusion, and the quiet certainty that something precious had been left behind in the wreckage. They told her she was lucky to be alive. They didn't tell her how to live with it. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the aircraft surge under her, heard the warning tone, saw the river rising to meet her windshield. She woke before dawn with her heart racing and the old ache in her chest, not fear exactly, but something like grief. She made coffee she barely tasted and sat by the window until the sky lightened. By the time she arrived at work, the story had already grown legs. People didn't ask her questions directly. They never did at first. Instead, they asked around her, whispered in hallways, looked at her a second longer than necessary. She caught fragments. She wasn't even assigned. Said she just got in and flew. No hesitation. It was strange, being the subject of a narrative she wasn't controlling. She'd spent years making sure nothing about her invited curiosity. Now curiosity had arrived anyway, uninvited and persistent. Mid-morning, a message came down from administration. Report to the conference room. Her stomach tightened. The room was too clean, too quiet, a place where decisions were made carefully and consequences were framed as policy. She recognized the posture of everyone seated there, the guarded expressions, the rehearsed neutrality. She stood when they entered. No one asked her to sit right away. They thanked her. That alone felt unreal. They spoke about bravery, about initiative, about extraordinary circumstances. Words that slid past her without sticking. She waited for the pivot, the part where they explained why what she'd done couldn't happen again. It came eventually. Protocol violations, liability, risk exposure. She listened without interrupting. She always did. Then someone asked the question she'd known was coming. Why didn't you disclose your prior flight experience? The room stilled. She could have lied. She lied better under worse pressure. But something about the last 24 hours had stripped her of the energy required to pretend. Because every time I did, she said quietly. It was used to tell me what I couldn't do anymore. Silence followed, not hostile, uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to deceive anyone, she continued. I was trying to work. No one argued with that. They told her an investigation would follow, that everything she'd done would be reviewed, that she should expect to be temporarily removed from flight-related duties. Grounded. The word landed harder than it should have. She nodded, thanked them, left without raising her voice. In the hallway, the weight finally caught up to her. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a second, just long enough to steady herself. She told herself she'd known this was coming, that consequences were the price of action, that she would pay it without complaint. Still, something inside her twisted. Later that afternoon, she received another message. The patient from the flight was asking for her. She froze, phone warm in her hand. Patients asked for nurses all the time. Gratitude visits, thank yous, closure. This felt different. She waited until the end of her shift before going, gave herself time to rehearse neutrality, to lock down the parts of herself that didn't belong in a hospital room. When she stepped inside, he was awake, pale, wired, very much alive. Their eyes met, and she knew immediately. Recognition is a strange thing. It doesn't need proof. It bypasses logic and settles directly into the bones. You, he said, voice rough. I knew it. Her chest tightened. I didn't see your face, he continued, almost apologetically. Back then, just your voice, the way you talked us through it, the way you didn't rush, like you had all the time in the world. She stayed by the door, suddenly unsure how close was appropriate. You flew me twice, he said, 10 years apart. She swallowed. I did my job. He shook his head. You did more than that. Emotion flickered across his face, pride, relief, something like awe, and she felt a familiar discomfort rise. She'd never known what to do with gratitude. It always felt heavier than anger. I've been looking for you, he said softly. Didn't even know if you were still alive. She looked down at her hands. I was, she said, just quieter. He smiled at that, not amused, understanding. They sat in silence for a moment, two people connected by something neither had chosen but both had carried. When she finally left the room, her legs were shaking. Outside, the hallway buzzed with activity, but she felt strangely untethered. Like the ground she'd been standing on for years had shifted, and she wasn't sure where to plant her feet next. She went home that night and took out the gloves again. Held them. Listened to what they stirred. For the first time since she'd been grounded, she didn't feel broken. She felt exposed. And sometimes, she realized, exposure is the first step toward healing, even when you're not sure you're ready for what comes next. Why did the silence after being seen feel louder than all the years she'd spent unseen? The question followed her into the dark like a second shadow, not accusatory, not urgent, just there, waiting. She lay awake on her couch instead of her bed, boots still on, jacket folded but untouched. The city outside her window hummed softly, traffic and distance and other people's lives moving forward without her permission. She stared at the ceiling and tried to catalog what she was feeling the way she used to catalog threats. Shock, relief, fear, a thin thread of pride she didn't quite trust. Being grounded again shouldn't have surprised her. The system always corrected deviations. That was what systems did. What unsettled her wasn't the punishment. It was how little it mattered compared to the look in that man's eyes when he'd recognized her. You flew me twice. She rolled onto her side and closed her eyes, immediately seeing the interior of a different aircraft. Night, dust, red instrument lights, a voice in her headset that sounded calmer than she felt. Her own. Back then she hadn't thought of herself as brave. She'd thought of herself as necessary. There was a difference. Bravery invited admiration. Necessity demanded action without applause. She lived her life trying to return to that smaller truth. Do what's needed, expect nothing. But now the world had noticed. And attention, she knew from experience, always came with a cost. The next morning her phone buzzed before sunrise. A message from administration, short, neutral, formal. She was to remain off flight status pending review. She was still expected to report to work. She stared at the screen longer than she needed to, then set the phone down and made coffee she forgot to drink. At work the shift felt different, not hostile, careful. People smiled at her a little too quickly. Conversations paused when she walked by, then resumed in lower voices. Someone from respiratory asked her if she'd always been a pilot, then apologized immediately for asking. She told them no, then yes, then realized neither answer felt complete. Late in the morning, she found herself restocking supplies near the trauma bays when she heard raised voices down the hall. Not shouting, tension. She didn't mean to listen. She always meant not to listen, but some instincts never leave. Can't just let this go, someone said, a male voice, frustrated. What if something had gone wrong? Another voice, older, calmer, but it didn't. That's not the point. She recognized the cadence of debate, risk versus outcome, rules versus results, the kind of argument that only happens when the answer scares everyone involved. She stepped away quietly. At lunch, she didn't eat. She sat outside instead, letting the heat press against her skin, grounding her. She touched the small tattoo behind her ear without thinking, a habit from another life. Her phone buzzed again. A number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it. Almost. Hello. Is this her? The voice was female, controlled, military adjacent in its restraint. This is Commander Hayes. I'm calling regarding the Fort Stewart incident. Her spine straightened instinctively. Yes, she said, this is her. There was a pause, not awkward, deliberate. I'm not calling in any official capacity, the woman said. At least not yet. Of course she was. I just wanted you to know, the voice continued, that what you did is being discussed, at levels you don't usually hear about. The words settled slowly. I see. Another pause, this one softer. You saved one of ours, the commander said. People don't forget that. Neither do I, she thought. They ended the call without promises, without instructions, without closure. She sat very still after, feeling the weight of it all pressing down, the sense that she was standing on the edge of something she hadn't planned to approach. That afternoon she was called into another meeting, smaller this time, fewer people, different energy. They asked about her past, not in the clipped, suspicious way she'd expected, in a way that suggested they were trying to understand something that didn't fit neatly into their frameworks. She answered carefully, truthfully, without embellishment. Yes, she'd flown before. Yes, she'd been trained to make decisions under pressure. Yes, she understood why what she'd done was a problem. But I'd do it again, she added quietly. The words surprised even her. No one reacted right away. Finally, one of them asked, why? She thought of the bleeding man, the empty cockpit, the math. Because sometimes, she said, doing nothing is the bigger risk. They dismissed her without resolution. That evening, she went to the hospital chapel. She wasn't particularly religious in the traditional sense, but the quiet helped. She sat in the back row and let the stillness settle into her bones. She thought about the letter she hadn't opened yet, the one from the military liaison that had been sitting on her kitchen counter since yesterday. She knew what it probably said, knew the language it would use. Opportunity, review, possibility. Once, those words would have been oxygen. Now they scared her. She wasn't sure she could survive another loss of the sky. Not again. Her phone vibrated. A message from the SEAL, simple. They're talking about you, good things. She smiled despite herself, then the smile faded. Good things always came with expectations. That night she dreamed she was flying again, but every time she reached for the controls, her hands passed through them like smoke. She woke up before dawn, heart pounding, the taste of metal in her mouth. On her day off, she drove without a destination. Let the road decide. Ended up near the coast, parked where the marsh met the water. She got out and walked until the ground softened under her boots. She thought about her grandmother, about the stories she used to tell her, about warriors who laid down their weapons not because they were weak, but because they had something else to protect. She thought about the people she'd trained, the nurses watching her now, wondering what kind of person she really was. And she thought about the simple truth she'd avoided for years. She missed it. Not the adrenaline, not the danger. The purpose. Late that afternoon, she finally opened the letter. It said exactly what she expected, and nothing she was prepared for. They were reviewing her medical status, reevaluating policies, asking questions that hadn't been asked before. It wasn't a guarantee. It was an invitation. She folded the letter and set it down carefully, like it might bite if handled too roughly. That night, she called the only person whose opinion still cut through the noise. Her grandmother listened without interrupting, let her speak until the words ran out. When the silence stretched, she finally said, "What are you afraid of?" The question landed cleanly. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "that if I go back, I'll lose it again." Her grandmother hummed softly on the other end of the line, a sound older than advice. "Child," she said gently, "you already know how to survive loss. You've been doing it for years." "And if I fail?" she asked. "Then you fail flying," her grandmother replied, "not hiding." The line went quiet. She stared out at the dark, at the suggestion of stars above the city glow. For the first time since she'd touched the controls again, she let herself imagine a future that didn't require shrinking. It scared her. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Hope. And hope, she knew, was dangerous. Because once it took hold, it demanded courage not just in crisis, but in choice. She didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time in a long time, she was asking the right question. What if the hardest part wasn't flying again, but deciding who she was allowed to be when no one was dying? The thought came to her in the quietest place she knew, early morning, hospital stairwell, the kind no one used unless they were avoiding something. She sat on the concrete step with her back against the wall, coffee cooling in her hands, listening to the building wake up around her. For years, crisis had given her permission. In chaos, there was clarity. Someone bleeding meant she could act. A failing machine meant there was no room for doubt. Decisions made themselves because delay was death. But now people were asking her to choose. And choice had always been more terrifying than danger. The review process moved slowly, the way institutions do when they're trying to protect themselves from their own reflection. Emails arrived with careful language. Meetings were scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. Her name traveled through offices she'd never seen, attached to phrases like exceptional circumstances and policy reconsideration. She stayed grounded, literally and emotionally. She worked her shifts, covered for coworkers, trained a new nurse who reminded her too much of herself, eager, capable, still unaware of how quickly the world could narrow your options. She corrected gently, encouraged quietly. At night she ran. Not far, not fast, just enough to feel her lungs work and her legs burn and her body remind her that it was still hers. Sometimes she dreamed of the cockpit again, not emergencies this time, routine flights, smooth air, the kind of flying that demanded discipline instead of desperation. Those dreams unsettled her more than the nightmares ever had. One afternoon, she was called into a different kind of meeting. No administrators, No risk managers. Just one man in civilian clothes with a posture that gave him away immediately. "You don't remember me," he said, standing as she entered. She studied his face, late 50s, close-cropped gray hair, eyes that had seen too much and learned how not to show it. "I remember your type," she said carefully. He smiled at that, not offended. "That's fair." He introduced himself simply. No rank, no titles, but his presence carried the weight of both. "I'm not here to recruit you," he said, "and I'm not here to pressure you." She waited. "I'm here because people like you are rare," he continued, "and systems don't know what to do with rare things." She felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Systems usually try to break them. "Yes," he agreed, "or hide them." They talked for almost an hour, not about flying, not really, about thresholds, about what happens when capability outpaces permission, about how many people quietly disappear because they don't fit a checkbox. "You scared some people," he said eventually. "I saved someone," she replied. "I know," he said, "but you did it without asking." She met his gaze. There wasn't time. "There never is," he said softly. "That's the problem." When the meeting ended, he handed her a card. No promise attached, just a number. "Call if you want to talk," he said. "Not about returning, about staying." Staying. The word followed her home like a question, without punctuation. That evening, she cooked dinner she barely touched and sat at her small kitchen table staring at the wall. The letter from the review board lay unopened beside her plate. She'd been avoiding it for 2 days now, as if not reading it could keep the future suspended. She thought about the SEAL in recovery, about the nurses she trained, about the helicopter sitting idle when no one else could fly it. She thought about the part of herself that only felt whole in motion. Finally, she opened the letter. It was cautious, conditional, bureaucratic. They acknowledged her prior service, her experience, the extraordinary circumstances of the incident. They were willing to grant a provisional clearance for evaluation only, supervised, limited. A foot in the sky, nothing more. She folded the letter slowly. 6 years ago, she would have accepted without hesitation. Now she felt something else rise. Anger. Not sharp, not explosive. Honest. They were still deciding how much of her they could tolerate. She didn't know yet what she would say. The call came 3 days later. A weather-related incident, civilian helicopter, inexperienced pilot, no fatalities but close enough to wake everyone up. They wanted her opinion, off the record. She listened to the details, asked a few questions, drew diagrams on a notepad without realizing she'd started. When she finished, the line on the other end was quiet. "That's not what our analysis showed," the voice said. "Your analysis assumes perfect conditions," she replied. "People don't fly in perfect conditions." Silence again. "Would you be willing," the voice asked carefully, "to consult?" Consult. Not fly, not lead. Advise. She closed her eyes. This was the compromise they were comfortable with. She agreed. The consulting role came with paperwork and boundaries, and the strange discomfort of being listened to without being trusted. She sat in rooms explaining things she'd once executed instinctively. She watched others struggle with decisions she could have made in seconds. Sometimes it frustrated her. Sometimes it terrified her, how close they came to missing the point. But something else happened too. People started asking better questions. They started listening differently. One nurse stayed after a session, eyes bright with something like relief. "No one ever explained it that way," she said. "I always thought freezing meant I wasn't cut out for this." The words hit harder than expected. "No," she said gently. "Freezing means you care. Training teaches you what to do next." The nurse nodded, shoulders relaxing for the first time that day. On her drive home, the woman realized something had shifted. She wasn't just being pulled back to the sky. She was being asked to shape what happened beneath it. Still, the longing didn't go away. It waited, patient, persistent. One night, weeks later, she stood on the hospital roof after a long shift, watching a helicopter lift off into the dark. The sound vibrated through her chest, familiar as a heartbeat. She didn't wave. She just watched. She imagined herself up there, not in crisis, not breaking rules, but doing the work she'd trained her whole life to do. She imagined losing it again. The thought hurt, but not as much as never trying. Her phone buzzed. A message from the review board. Decision pending, final meeting scheduled. She took a slow breath and let the night air fill her lungs. For years, she'd lived as if survival was enough. Now she understood something different. Survival was the beginning. What came after required a different kind of courage, the kind that doesn't wait for alarms or blood or broken machines. The kind that chooses. She turned away from the edge and headed back inside, carrying with her a quiet resolve that surprised her with its steadiness. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't disappear again. Not into silence. Not into safety. Not into someone else's idea of who she was allowed to be. Sometimes strength isn't proven in the moment you save a life. Sometimes it's proven in the moment you decide how to live your own. What happens when the moment finally comes, and there's no alarm to tell you what to do? She felt that question settle into her bones as she walked into the final meeting. No sirens, no urgency, just a long table, closed folders, and people who believed time itself made decisions safer. She took her seat and folded her hands. They didn't shake. That surprised her. The chair at the far end cleared his throat. He spoke carefully, like someone stepping across thin ice. They acknowledged her service again, repeated the facts everyone already knew, described the incident in language that sanded down its edges until it almost sounded manageable. Then came the verdict. They were prepared to clear her for limited flight duties. Conditional, evaluated quarterly, always provisional, always revocable. A leash made of courtesy. She listened without interrupting, letting the words land where they would. When they finished, the room waited. This was the part they were used to. Gratitude, relief, a nod, maybe even tears. She felt none of it. Instead, she felt a quiet, stubborn clarity rise up, steady as trim in level flight. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was calm, respectful. "I won't be accepting." The silence was immediate and complete. Someone leaned forward. "I'm not sure you understand." "I do," she said gently. "You're offering me permission that can be withdrawn the moment I make someone uncomfortable." Another pause, longer this time. "You want full clearance," someone said. "No," she replied. "I want honesty from you and from myself." She took a breath, not because she needed it, but because this mattered. "I don't fly well while waiting to be taken away again. I've lived like that. It turns skill into fear, and fear is dangerous." They exchanged looks, confusion, concern, the beginnings of resistance. "I'm not asking you to change your system for me," she continued. "I'm asking you to understand that I won't shrink to fit it anymore." One of them asked the question she'd expected all along. "What if we say no?" She met his eyes. "Then I keep doing the work that keeps people alive," she said. "I just won't pretend it isn't mine." She stood before anyone could respond, thanked them again, left. In the hallway, her legs finally felt weak. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, letting the adrenaline ebb. This was different from crisis. There was no checklist for choosing yourself. She went home and slept for 3 hours, the deep, dreamless kind that only comes after something is released. When she woke, there were messages waiting, missed calls, voicemails from numbers she didn't recognize. She didn't listen to them yet. Instead, she went for a run, longer this time, let her breath find a rhythm, let her thoughts scatter and return. By the time she got back, she felt ready. The first voicemail was from the consultant she'd met weeks earlier, the one who'd talked about systems and rare things. "You weren't supposed to say no," he said, not unkindly, "but I'm glad you did call me." She did. They talked late into the evening, about autonomy, about boundaries, about what leadership looks like when it isn't enforced from above. "I don't need you in a cockpit to trust you," he told her. "I need you where decisions are made before the cockpit is empty." The offer wasn't glamorous. No uniforms, no call signs. It was quieter than that, structural, foundational. A role designing protocols, training standards, decision trees built for reality instead of ideal conditions. "You'd fly sometimes," he added, "but more importantly, you'd teach people how not to need heroes." She laughed softly at that. "Heroes are expensive," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "and unreliable." She accepted. The transition was strange. She wasn't leaving the hospital. She wasn't returning to the military. She was stepping sideways into a space that didn't have a clear name yet. She spent her days with whiteboards and simulations, with nurses and pilots and administrators who came in skeptical and left thoughtful. She spoke less about herself and more about decision-making under pressure, about math, about margins that matter. She insisted on one rule. No one was allowed to be punished for speaking up early. It changed everything. Mistakes were caught sooner. Flights were delayed for the right reasons. People asked for help without whispering. And sometimes, when the schedule aligned and the crew was short, she flew. Not because she had to, because she could. The first time back in the left seat under the new arrangement, she sat quietly during pre-flight, letting the familiar motions settle her nerves. She noticed the small things she'd missed, the way light played across the panel, the subtle vibration through the pedals. She didn't feel like she was reclaiming anything. She felt like she was arriving. The flight was routine, smooth, uneventful. She landed without applause. It was perfect. Weeks later, she visited the man she'd flown twice. He was walking with a slight limp now, stubborn and alive. They sat outside with coffee that tasted like nothing special and talked about ordinary things. "You know," he said, "I always thought finding you would feel bigger." She smiled, "Me too." "But this is better," he added. "You're real." "So are you," she said. They watched the river for a while. Neither of them needed to say more. On a quiet evening near the end of summer, she drove north. Long roads, familiar mountains. She stopped where the air smelled like pine and memory. She brought nothing with her this time. No gloves, no letters. Just herself. She sat with the silence and let it speak back. For years, she'd believed her worth appeared only in emergencies, that without crisis, she faded. She knew better now. Strength wasn't the absence of fear. It was the refusal to be ruled by it. She had flown when it mattered most. Now she was building something that would matter longer. As the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, she felt a quiet satisfaction settle in, not pride, not triumph. Alignment. Sometimes redemption isn't about returning to who you were. Sometimes it's about choosing who you're willing to become, and standing by that choice even when no one is watching. She turned back toward the road as night gathered, steady and unafraid, knowing the sky would still be there when she needed it. And knowing, finally, that she no longer needed permission to belong. Why did peace feel heavier than any aircraft she had ever flown? The realization came to her on a morning so ordinary it almost offended her. No alarms, no urgent calls, no wind rattling windows or radios crackling with someone else's fear. Just sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor and the slow, patient sound of water boiling for tea. For years she had lived braced for impact. Now there was nothing to brace against. She sat at the table and let that truth settle. The quiet didn't rush her. It didn't demand anything. It simply waited, the way life does when it finally trusts you to handle it. Work had found its rhythm. The program she helped build was no longer theoretical, it was breathing. Crews trained differently now. They spoke up sooner. They trusted themselves and each other in ways that didn't rely on luck or heroics. She watched it happen from the margins the way she liked, correcting here, asking questions there, letting others take credit when things went right. Not because she was hiding, because she no longer needed to be seen to know she mattered. On days when she flew clean, by the book. Calm skis, clear decisions, no defiance in it, no proving, just work done well. And on days when she didn't, she was just as steady. That had been the surprise. The past still visited her, of course. It always would. Certain smells, certain sounds. A song hummed under her breath without thinking. But the memories no longer dragged her backward. They stood beside her, quieter now, like old companions who'd finally set their packs down. One afternoon, months after everything had settled, she received a handwritten note. Not official, no letterhead. Just a few lines. You probably won't remember me. I froze once. You didn't. You taught me how not to stay frozen. I'm still here because of that. She read it twice, then folded it and placed it in a drawer she kept for things that mattered quietly. Later that week, she visited the roof again. Not because she needed to, because she wanted to. The city spread out below her, familiar and alive. A helicopter lifted off in the distance, its sound rolling across the air like a distant wave. She felt it in her chest, the old pull, but it no longer hurt. She smiled. She thought about the version of herself who once believed worth had an expiration date, who thought being grounded meant being finished, who had learned to survive by shrinking. That woman had done the best she could with what she knew. This one knew more. She knew that identity wasn't granted by uniforms or titles or clearance levels. It was built, decision by decision, when no one was keeping score. She knew that silence could be chosen, not endured. And she knew that strength didn't always look like action. Sometimes it looked like restraint, like teaching instead of doing, like stepping back so others could step forward. That evening, she called her grandmother. They didn't talk about flying, or the past, or what might come next. They talked about the weather, about a neighbor's dog, about a basket half finished and in no hurry to be completed. Before hanging up, her grandmother said, "You sound settled." She considered that. "I think I am," she replied. "Good," her grandmother said. "That means you listened." To what, she almost asked. But she already knew. She listened to the part of herself that had survived without becoming small, the part that had learned when to act and when to let be, the part that no longer needed crisis to justify its existence. Later that night, lying in bed, she thought about the moment everyone remembered, the warning light, the decision, the hands on the controls. It would always be part of her story. But it was no longer the center. The center was quieter than that. The center was a woman who had learned that dignity doesn't need witnesses, that courage doesn't always announce itself, that redemption doesn't require returning to the sky in flames. Sometimes it arrives on an ordinary morning, with tea cooling on the table and the day unfolding without urgency. She closed her eyes and breathed, slow and even. Tomorrow would come, and the next day, and the one after that. She would meet them all the same way, present, steady, unafraid. Because in the end, she hadn't grabbed the controls to be a hero. She'd done it because there was work that needed doing. And once the work was done, she stayed. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.